What is up, guys? This is Teresa Yanaros. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I have Stefano Gandini. I got it right. Thank you so
Perfect.
much for being here. We are so excited to have Stefano with us today. He launched a YouTube channel, what was it, a few months ago?
Yeah, about 4 months ago now.
4 months ago? Yeah. And it's interesting how we came into contact because I actually saw your content come up on my Instagram and I loved what you were talking about because you've gone from New Age to Jesus. You were sharing a lot of really good content. And so I reached out. I was like, hey, friend from across the way, we are in the same space. And so I'm just really excited to have you on the show tonight. I want to get into your testimony. I want to dig into that. And for those of you who are live right now, please feel free to jump down in the chat, say where you're from. We're glad to have you. If you guys have any questions for us as we're talking, feel free to jump into the chat and put your questions in all caps, just so that we know that they're questions. It's easier for us to see. And we're going to go ahead and take it away. So, Stefano, can we anchor into the beginning part of your testimony? I want to anchor into your upbringing. Talk to us about how you were raised and your family and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on, Teresa. Excited to be here and to share. I'm a first generation Guatemalan American. So my parents are immigrants from Guatemala. I was born here in Southern California, and I'm one of three. So I'm the youngest of three. I have an older brother and an older sister. Like most Hispanic families, we were raised in the Catholic tradition, and both of my parents are pretty devout. My mom, especially, was the more devout one of my parents. My dad kind of started, I would say, became um, more committed to his faith later as I kind of grew older. But it was a very important part of our upbringing, our faith and going to mass every Sunday, going to Sunday school, going through, all the sacraments, baptism, first communion, confirmation. Um, but I would say one of the main things growing up for me and my siblings was the importance of our education, right? And so again, kind of the classic American dream of, immigrants coming to America to pursue the American dream, to pursue better opportunities. And so that was instilled in us at a very young age. So my brother is currently an engineer. He has his own engineering company. My sister's a doctor. And so I was kind of following in my brother's footsteps to become an engineer as well. And so I went to USC and I got my degree, my bachelor's degree in industrial and systems engineering. And at the same time, when I left to university, like many young people, that was basically when I disconnected myself from my Catholic Christian faith. And so it was kind of a situation for me where I felt like I was only Catholic because I was born into a Catholic family, right? So I'd never really fully connected with it. And I think as I grew older, especially in the education system, started to really question, all the everything that you hear in secular, society and culture, right? Questioning that or believing that the Bible and Christianity was just created to control people and suppress people and to limit people from understanding, the fullness of truth and so started to I think those seeds were starting to be planted in my mind like in high school.
Let me have you take a pause for just a second. I want
Yeah,
to hear specifics on this because you and I, it's interesting because we have similar testimonies on some threads, and so I want to park for a second in university. Can
sure.
you talk out what that experience was like when you entered into university? Was it a certain class or teacher or a certain kind of topic, or what was that experience like for you when you came into that information that was against your Catholic upbringing?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting because actually right before you asked that question, I was going to say, and I haven't really talked too much about this yet. And it's one of those things where like I think as you continue to reflect on your whole journey, right, you start to remember like more specific moments that were really important moments. Like you're, I think in this question, what you're getting at, right, is like when did those seeds start to be planted? So I think for me, it actually started, I would say, in high school, and I was reading. I remember in high school a lot of those kind of what's it called the like the existential, like nihilistic readings. And so I remember reading like Albert Camus, The Stranger, A lot of these different, like Ayn Rand, what's it called? A lot of these kind of really emphasizing like the individual and again like the suppression of authoritarian, like totalitarian governments and things like that. And so I think and then I just recently remembered I started listening to like Alan Watts in like high school as well. And so just starting to like listen to those like, those like Alan Watts YouTube videos and things like that, I think back in high school. So I think those seeds were planted in high school, and I was actually going through like a pretty deep, like internal, like secret depression at the time, like because I was so conflicted with my upbringing and my, family's Catholic faith, and then internally feeling like none of this makes any sense. Like I felt the temptations of wanting to indulge in the pleasures of the world, but I was like, always felt the pressure to have to maintain that like perfect, good Catholic boy persona. And so I had that internal tension starting in high school. Then when I went off to college, it was like, this is my opportunity to like be free, right? And so I just at that point really kind of put, as far as like faith and God, I would say I kind of put that on the back burner and was just kind of like agnostic, like not really caring too much. I think my mindset was more at that time just like, I don't know what the truth is about God, and like nobody does, so what's the point? Like there's no point in wasting my mental energy trying to figure that out. I just want to have a good time, right? So college for me was like, still studied hard, but also started to party really hard. I joined a fraternity at USC. USC is like, prestigious university, but also very well known as like a big party school in their fraternity scene. And so, I really started to indulge in, just the pleasures of alcohol, partying, drugs, women. And so at that time, again, I wasn't really, it's really weird because like I wasn't really focused on God or like the faith aspect. Again, I would say I was like more agnostic at that point. But that was when I started this personal development blog, which was how I got into the online space. Was again, the goal was like, I just want to have the full college experience, right? So it was like a personal development blog about how to like be more productive, for me, what was really important at the time was how to overcome my social anxiety, how to find like purpose and meaning in life. And so started building that blog like summer after my sophomore year in college. So senior year, I started to become really passionate about that. And it was kind of a weird dichotomy because I'm like, on the one hand, writing all these like blog posts about like how to be like a better student and just a better person. But then I'm still like on the weekends and even sometimes during the week getting like blackout drunk and like having these like ridiculously, reckless college experiences. And so I was kind of, between those two worlds in college, deep into self-help and also just like partying a lot. And then it wasn't until after college. So I graduated with my degree in engineering. I worked for a brief period in tech consulting. I was working for a global consulting firm in LA. But the blog continued growing, and I was getting more visibility with that, and I was really enjoying that, and that kind of opened me up to the possibilities of online entrepreneurship. And so I ended up leaving behind my corporate career to focus on turning this blog into a full-time business. So that's kind of how I stumbled into the life coaching space. And so I started my own online life coaching business. And then it was shortly after that period, I started the business in 2016. And then it was in 2017, I would say that's like when I really started. And I like to say now, I recently said this the other day, like I think self-help is like a gateway drug into new age spirituality. And so I think 2017, because there is some distinction there, but there's definitely an underlying ideology. But there's definitely a point, like some self-help obviously starts to stray way more into the new age, law of attraction, manifestation, all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, by 2017 is when I really started to go deep into the new age stuff, and
I'm gonna pause you really quick. Okay, so
Yeah,
on the life coaching side, what was it that made you get interested in life coaching, and then how did you actually launch that business? Like, did you get any kind of like, did you take any classes, or did you like, what did that process look like for you?
Yeah, so for me, it was a fairly organic process in the sense that I So the first way that I attempted to monetize my blog, well, I had like ads and I was making like a little bit of money from it, but not much. And so then I decided to launch a video course. And so the course was about like how to create your passion, create your passion in 30 days. And so it was like, I recorded some videos and put together like this workbook and everything. And so I launched that, and that's how I made like my first $1,000 online. And in the process though of making that course, I was basically jumping on like calls with people who were like following my blog and just friends and talking to people and trying to figure out like what to put in the course, right? What were they struggling with? What were the pain points? And so in that process of doing that, it was really helpful to find out right exactly like what to put in the course, but also like I found that I actually really did enjoy that like one-on-one. I was basically coaching them already. And so then that was kind of how at some point, I don't know how I came across it, because I definitely hadn't even like ever thought of being a life coach. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
obviously a very traditional thing, especially coming from an engineering background.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. What I find really interesting in what you're describing right now as we're walking along your testimony is the concept of getting into the online sphere, right? And then starting to network and connect with people
Right.
and press into a gift and a talent that you had, and you're like, oh, I can actually help people do this. You're sharing about technology and media, and then you find yourself in a place where now you are dipping your toe into the coaching community, which is a whole big multiverse,
Yeah.
right? And you've got all the different subsections of coaching. And so it's interesting to hear, because you said it was like a gateway drug, right? And then we're about to get into like the new age side and your introduction into that. But what
Right.
I want the audience to hear right now, and this is really important, is that there are usually baby steps into these things. And when you look at the trajectory of the testimony, you can often see the little kind of steps into the larger community of the new age. And it's so pervasive online and everywhere nowadays that most of these different, anywhere you land, there can be gateways from those different communities that draw into the new age. And so I think it's important that you bring up the self-help side, because as we talk about cultural traps, and we talk a lot about cultural traps on this channel, that's definitely one of them, right? And so I think that's an important thing for people to hear and recognize and keep in their back pocket as they're traversing into any of these areas, so that they can assess and analyze what it is that they're engaging in and make sure that they're keeping their practices and beliefs tethered to Christ and not walking over into the new age. So let's open it up now and talk us through how you went from coaching into new age ideation.
Yeah. And actually, I did just remember one other thing. As far as in college, like I was saying, I wasn't spending too much time thinking about like faith or God or things like that. But there was a book I read. I think it was the summer after my sophomore year, I believe, sometime around then, called Conversations with God. I don't know if you've heard of that or read that book, but that's a book by Neil Donald Walsh. That once I read that book, that I think is what kind of brought my interest and my curiosity and fascination in the spiritual realms back online. Although again, I didn't like it, kind of like planted again the next seed for sure that like really for the first time exposed me to a type of spirituality that was not Christianity, right? And so, and obviously anybody who's familiar with that book, that's definitely a book to be aware of and to be cautious of, because it's a very anti-Christian and contradicts a lot of Christian ideas, and really was like the first time that again I was hearing a an ideology that rejected the idea of sin and evil and starts to speak in this language that like everything is God, and so all paths lead to God, and that type of ideology was, I think, planted with that book, and that was like my favorite book for many years.
Why did that appeal to you?
I think it's again, if you're in that space that I was in, and like I think your typical like rebellious teenager going off to college where you're just like wanting freedom, right? Like that idea of freedom, which is I would say like a perverse idea of freedom that from my current understanding of being able to just do whatever you want to do, right? Like that's what the whole ideology in retrospect now of this underlying ideology of New Age, which is essentially that you are God, everything is God, we're all God, gives you the freedom to do whatever you want to do and justify it however you want to justify it. And so
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds really shiny, right?
Yeah.
On the surface. I want to take a moment to pause because what you're describing right now is something that we in the academy that I run that helps people come out of the new age and anchor to Christ. We call this occult snapping. So I'm going to bring this infographic up on the screen. Oh, that's the wrong one. Hold on, try this one. Okay, so when we talk about occult anchoring, which is to say how people get drawn into the occult, you have Satan that's casting a deception, and then the human entertains that lie, gives it attention, and acknowledges it. And there's always an element of pride here. The doorway's open when the human engages with the lie. Now, what we see here is occult snapping. And so that's the term we use for this worldview destabilization when you're engaging in reading the content, Conversations with God, which, by the way, one of our authors, Noelle, on Spirit Sanctified, in her testimony, Conversations with God was actually her occult snapping experience as well. It was that book that opened the door and
Yeah.
really appealed to
I
this
think that
concept of
one, I think that
control.
one gets so many people, that book. Yeah, see, now I'm remembering all these things. I found out about that book on this website called High Existence that I was reading at the time. And it's like, this alternative spirituality website. It's also where I started reading a lot about psychedelics on that website. Yeah, that website was very popular. I think it still exists today. I haven't actually looked back at it in many, many years, but I'm sure a lot of people found it also. Probably, like, I wouldn't be surprised if maybe your writer, whoever you're speaking of here, might have found it on an online forum or something like that where they're talking about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. She's from Germany, so it'd be interesting to ask her that question. But Conversations with God is a big one that comes up for a lot of people that went
Yeah.
into the New Age. Okay, so you're talking about this book, and you get involved in the ideation or the belief aspect. So what happens next?
So, okay, so then to jump forward a little bit again. So after I graduated, left behind my corporate career, started the life coaching business, and and then in 2017, I think the next big kind of catalyst, or as you're calling it, like this occult snapping. So, which I love that, yeah, that term and how you just kind of break it down. And I'm, again, engineering background, systems engineering background. I love the flow charts and the graphs and everything. Um, I went to this, it was like advertised as like a leadership, emotional intelligence training in LA. And it was like, I remember when I like first heard about it, I was attending another workshop. It was like a branding workshop because, again, I was in the early stages of starting my coaching business. So I was like attending this branding workshop. And then it was at that workshop, I heard this person talking about this like mysterious leadership and emotional intelligence training thing. But like, I remember just the way he was like talking about it. It was like very like, there was like, I got this like weird, like, there was something like very weird and like ambiguous about it, like mysterious, ambiguous. Like I wasn't totally clear like what it was, and he wasn't like fully revealing like what it was. But it really like fascinated me, and there was a sense from this person who, um, again, he came to the workshop as well. He got there like late, so there was already one like, who's this person that's like showing up late? But then he was like very successful. He had I believe it was a copywriting business. And so he was like crushing it in his copywriting business. This was down in San Diego. And he had like this nice, he's like just a couple years older than me. I was like 22, 23 at the time. So he's probably like in his mid 20s. He had like a beach house in San Diego. He's like crushing it. So again, in that version of me that was like so desperate and seeking that like significance, the wealth, the success, like all of that, he really caught my attention. And then he invited me and a couple other guys over to his house after the workshop. So like, then I'm like at his house, right? I'm like, whoa, this is like crazy, like so cool. Like, how did he do this? And then he's talking about this workshop thing again. And so basically I just remember the way I received like my experience of that was like, this guy knows something I don't know. And two, this workshop helped him, it sounded like helped him get this, right? And manifest all this stuff. And so then the next day he like called me and like personally invited me to attend this workshop. And it was like, again, this like this personal invitation, kind of secretive thing. Like it's like not like a publicly advertised thing. It's all like invite only kind of situation. That's at least how I experienced it. And there is actually an aspect to that, because then basically I go to this, I end up signing up for this workshop. I think it was like $500 or something for like 3 days, but it's like really intense. It's like 10 hours a day or something like that. Or I think the first level might be less than that, might be like 5 to 7 hours, something like that. But that's like the first level, and there's 3 levels. So after you do the first level, then they sell you on the next level. Then I joined the next level, which is I think at that point it goes to like a week long, and it's like 10 hours a day, and so I do that, and then after that, there's one final level that's like the most intense level. It's like a 3 month, I believe, like a 3 month um, super intense experience of like meetings, and there's all these like missions you have to do, and then also part of it, to tie it back to that guy who invited me, is you have to enroll people into the program as part of completing the program. And so
What was in the program?
long story short, to answer that question, looking back, I'm like, that was essentially like a new age cult that I joined. And starting in the first like workshop, the basic level, um, was the first time I ever did like one of those like really deep meditations. That's like the intention is to like access your unconscious mind, start rewriting your beliefs, and it's all framed in the light of empowerment, self-empowerment, creating a new identity, and healing your past wounds and traumas and all this stuff. So that was the first time I had done like a little bit of like meditation and stuff like that on my own up prior to that, but it was in that program that like it was the first time it was like these really deep, like accessing the subconscious mind. And looking back on it now too, and I haven't talked too much about this either, I think I might have mentioned it briefly in my testimony video, but it's just like there's so much stuff. I'm sure notice this too in your own testimony, and all the people you talk to and work with, like you start to see all these patterns, right? And like a lot of the, again, like manipulation and deception, and taking advantage of people who are vulnerable and seeking either like healing or success, or there's again this like desperate seeking for something. And unfortunately, yeah, it really, at the time, again, for me, I was still at the stage where it seemed to be very empowering, and I thought, again, I was like accessing and unlocking all this new knowledge and information and potential, and all of that. But it really then, from that point on, I would say, started to distance myself more from like my family, my old
I'm
friends.
going to pause you really quick. So, on this thread, I want to ask you, was there anything that happened when you were messing around with these altered states of consciousness and the programming of the mind and those sorts of things and the practices that they were teaching you? Did anything happen that freaked you out or scared you or destabilized your worldview and made you believe in the practices more?
Yeah, I'm sure there was many things. I'm trying to think of something specific.
You mentioned like occult knowledge, like receiving occult knowledge. Was
Yeah.
there anything specific around that? Like, what was that experience like?
So I think the main thing, and the main message in that program that was constantly being like reiterated, was this idea that you are the source. Like that's the language they would use. So again, at this point, it was still a bit more implicit, although at this point saying you are the source is starting to get more explicit later in my journey, when I ended up moving to Bali, and one of the new age hubs and capitals of the world, places like that, like people are just straight up saying like you are God. And that honestly freaked me out, and we can talk more about that later. But at this point, I think I hadn't really made that connection. It just seemed so empowering to me, right? Like, and so the idea is that you are the source, meaning you're the source of anything you want. You're the source of wealth. You're the source of happiness. You're the source of love. So the idea again is like whatever you're seeking, right? It's not out there. It comes from within you, and all you have to do is access that within yourself. And so again, a lot of these, exercises and trainings we were doing were all about that. And so I think, yeah, it's hard to pinpoint one
Okay.
specific thing. There's a couple things that come to mind, like exercises we did that were all just reinforcing that belief,
Okay.
right?
So how did this play out in your life? I know you started to talk about family. So how did this start to affect your life?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think at that point I was just, I think starting to reach like, it's like this trajectory that's like this exponential trajectory. And I was starting to reach like that climax of like excitement and like and pride, really, that like I'm so powerful and like I can create anything I want and I can do anything I want. And anybody who says anything negative, right? Anybody who has negative energy or, like bad vibes, you have to like cut them out of your life. And so I was already starting to have a lot of conflict with my parents, from the moment. I mean, it was huge. It was a huge decision when I decided to quit my corporate job. And so obviously, they were very concerned, like spent all this time, working so hard to get to that point. And it was, in their minds, like I'm kind of like throwing it all away for what, right? So there was already that conflict and that tension there. But then now, as I was going deeper into this stuff, on some level, again, whether I was conscious of it or not, I'm like more and more firmly rejecting like Christianity. And I think my parents were starting to recognize that like what I was getting into was like dangerous territory, but they didn't understand it and they didn't really know, have the language to speak on it. So, we'd get in arguments and conversations about things like that. And looking back now, I think this is an interesting point I've come to realize. Like, we would get into like these arguments and I could like seemingly like win the argument, but just because someone might be a better speaker, more eloquent speaker, or just be able to speak on something better, doesn't necessarily mean you're right. And so I think my parents were right, but obviously, unfortunately, they didn't know how to. And this is why I think it's so important that people like yourself and myself are sharing and talking about these things, so that Christians who might be good Christians and well-intentioned Christians, not only one are aware of it for themselves, but also know how to engage in dialogue with that, when they might come across somebody who is dabbling in those spaces.
Absolutely. I think that's critical here. And I think it's interesting given that you were raised in a very strong Catholic, Christian, spirit filled household, as was I, right? And there's that element of when we were both grounded fully in the new age, steeped in it, believe, drink the Kool Aid at this point, following the belief systems, right? And then entering into conversations with family where I don't know about you, and I'm going to toss this to you because I want to share my experience and I want to hear yours. For me, it was like I, at that point in my journey, believed that Christianity was just a slice of the pie that was the
Yeah.
full breadth of the truth. So I was able to just discount by saying, oh, okay, well, yeah, I believe that too. It fits in also, it
Right.
plugs in also,
Right.
instead of really grasping the reality, which is to say Jesus Christ is the stumbling block to all of these belief systems, right? But my parents also, or my family, I'm particularly thinking about my mom right now because she's a very strong Christian woman. And I could see, like looking back now, right, like you described, she didn't have the language to speak on these things because she had not gone through the new age. She wasn't in the occult, right? And so she didn't have the experience to be able to speak my language, but she was able to come alongside me and offer encouragement and stand firm against my beliefs, but be loving and caring and firm in her Christian faith, and pray for me
Yeah.
and not close me out,
Yeah.
but be firm against me in those ways, but not mean, just talking about how she was excited about her faith. So I think my mom handled me in a beautiful way because I mean, there are so many ways that you could go about it. And unfortunately, a lot of us, we're going to fail and we're going to mess up when we're trying to engage with people and really trying to be there for them and do the right thing and affect them and reach them in the right way. But I'm curious, what was that experience like for you with your family when you were entering into these conversations with them?
Yeah, it was kind of a mixed bag, because there would be times, I think, again, where we would definitely get into like arguments, and it would just make me more angry and like frustrated, um and them as well on their end. But there were also times when I think they did a better job of kind of holding that balance, like you're saying, of like, you know being firm in their convictions, but also not pushing me away. Um, and so overall, I mean, I'm super grateful you mentioned too, like I know my mom and she would always tell me like she never stopped praying for me, right? So she was always praying for me. We would kind of again get into these, these little arguments or sometimes not so little arguments, and that would create again more tension and stuff, but they were always still there for me, and they were, my mom was still always praying for me. It was more so me distancing myself from them, right, because I felt that they were just like trying to hold me back and they didn't understand. And again, just that, yeah, that pridefulness, right, of like, oh, I understand the everything, and they're
Yeah.
not getting it.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going
So
to pause you. I want to pause you for just a second because I want to walk us in and ground us here for a second in your testimony. So, we've talked about Stefano's gateway factors, the factors that led him toward the occult. He talks about his family upbringing, which is to say the good, strong Christian upbringing. But then the gateway factors here were going to college and coming into contact with all of these secular beliefs, but also this book, Conversations with God, and some of these other books that he was listening or reading, and then some of the things he was listening to with Alan Watts and those sorts of things. And then we have the concept of the occult snapping, where he really gets drawn into these beliefs. He gets into this New Age cult. He goes through this process where he's learning occult beliefs and he's going down the rabbit hole deeper into occult bondage. So what we're going to shift into now is Stefano's going to tell us about how he went down the rabbit hole into the basically the pit of the occult. So we want to talk about what happened that made
yeah.
you hit the rock bottom, so to speak, or what people often describe as the tippy top. Because as you know and I know, when you're in the occult, your rock bottom actually kind of sometimes looks like you're sailing the highs of the world. But I want to hear you talk out what spiraled you down into the deepest part of the pit before you got out.
Yeah. So I'll try to kind of speed it up, summarize it a bit, because there's still quite a bit. So I would say the first big thing again was so 2017, I did that New Age cult thing. I also met a girl who I started dating in that program, who was also got me more into like astrology and like those types of things. And so that relationship didn't last very long, but she also, I would say, kind of pulled me deeper into some of those things. And then shortly after that, I went to Bali first on a retreat. And then when I was there, and it was like a meditation yoga retreat in Bali, it was like a 10-day retreat. And when I was there, I had this like vision of myself living in Bali. And so then I like decided in that moment, okay, I'm going to move to Bali. And so I came back home, and then like I think it was like 3 months later, I bought a one-way ticket, flew to Bali, moved to Bali. And so then I lived in Bali for 4 months. And that was actually a super intense experience, because I just like I was at the peak of like my coaching business. Like right before I bought the one-way ticket, I was like crushing it again, applying all these like law of attraction manifestation things. I like 8x my like business like income within a few months. Felt like I was on top of the world. Bought a one-way ticket to Bali, and then I came like crashing down because I was super irresponsible with my spending, and I literally just like completely ran out of money. And then I like fell into this spiral of like shame and guilt and embarrassment, and I couldn't get new clients. And so I was just like literally days in Bali where I like didn't know where I was going to be sleeping, had like no money, and like this like continually happened. And just by the grace of God, just kindness of strangers and a few people that I knew here and there, I was able to kind of scrape my way through that. And I did ultimately end up having to call my parents after 4 months, and like just continuing to have to go through this process of, again, just like everything going wrong that could possibly go wrong. Kept getting Bali belly, kept getting sick, and like, but I was also still simultaneously going to like all the breathwork things and all the yoga things and all the ecstatic dance, all these like new age things I was living in Ubud, which again is like, it's like literally like one of the biggest hubs of all the new age people coming from all over the world. And it's like, for me, it was like going there was like, I felt like I made it, right? I was like, I made it. But then immediately come crashing down. So I'd end up calling my parents. Super humbling for me to like, again, been pushing them away, like having all these like fights and tensions with them, and then having to call them and be like, I'm out of money. Like I'm exhausted. Like I just can't go on. I can't do anything. Like, can you please like help me get home? They're like, of course, like, we'll buy your ticket back home. Like, don't worry about it. Like, everything's okay. So that was a very, you know, humbling and just, yeah, just really, I like to say it was kind of like my first actually like coming back to God moment, because up until that point, I had kind of stopped using the word God. Like a lot of people in the New Age, you just talk about the universe and consciousness and all that stuff. But at that point, like before that phone call, right, it was like I had to cry out to God. I was like, God, I can't do this anymore. Like, what do I do? And obviously I ended up deciding like, all right, I'm just going to call my parents, like let them know what's going on, and go back home and figure it out. And so that was a first kind of humbling experience, coming back to God moment. So I came back home, moved back in with my parents, you know, took a few months, I think like a couple months just to like, yeah, recuperate. It just, that was all like a very like traumatizing experience for me. Again, to basically move to the other side of the world and like completely lose everything and like essentially be like homeless and like not knowing anybody in this other foreign country. But so there was a lot there, but that's the long story short of that. Then I realized, well, I took that break and again, kind of felt like at the time, like I was like, all right, God, like whatever, like, I don't know. I thought I knew what I was doing. Clearly, like I need to reevaluate some things. So I kind of took like, I don't know how long, a few months break. I like worked at my brother's engineering company for a little bit just to like start getting back on my feet. But then I think it was after like 6 months or so, I just like went straight back into it. And so then I got connected with this other like new age community in the area, and they were doing a lot of psychedelics. So this is when I started to get really into psychedelics. I did DMT for my first time. I did DMT a second time. And that I would say would be the next like ultimate like occult snapping, right? Because then I basically, after the second time I did DMT, believed that I had like conquered death. And I believed that like, you know, like I was like invincible and like nothing could stop me. And so I just like went completely like self-delusional at that point. And yeah,
let's pause on that for a
really
second.
downhill from there. And then shortly after that is what led to my,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, this is important though. So I want to take a moment to park on this. So we're going to pull this infographic back up. So this concept of the psychedelics and the DMT and what you're describing here, conquering death, having the belief that you've conquered death, right? This is a perfect example of the occult anchoring process. And this is, so when we go into the fourth step here and we sit on the display, which we were talking about occult snapping, right? That worldview is destabilized because Satan offers lying signs and wonders. And what you will hear when people talk about this kind of thing is they'll say something worked. So I always say beware of what works, that which works, because people will say, oh, I did this thing and then it worked, right? But the important part, and this is why I want to move to step 5, is that it's the anchor. What is this? There's a belief attached to the lie. That's the worldview shift, right? And so with this, for you, the belief was, okay, I've conquered death, right? So it's an interesting thing here that it twirled you even deeper, right? Where you're like, okay, I've had this experience, and then you apply some piece of information, you tie it to that experience. And so you think that that experience means one thing, but when people come out of the occult, what they often find is that they have all these different circumstances, these events that have happened, you know, and they have to untangle, like, okay, what did I believe that was false based on that experience? I attributed this false piece of information that I thought was truth and anchored it in at that experience. And so I want to hear you talk out now, like after hitting rock bottom, like what was it that, what we call in my academy, the gig is up moment, right? So when you hit rock bottom of the occult, you have something that absolutely wakes you up, makes you realize that there's something just not right about what you're experiencing. Talk us through that.
Yeah. So there's the final, that was like 2020, I think, was the second time I did DMT. So then over the next 2 years, again, it just really, hit that peak contrast between like on the outward appearance, I seem to be like living my dream life. I moved into this like mansion in Venice Beach because again, I like manifested that and was living with all these other like spiritual entrepreneurs. When I was there, I met another woman at this Hollywood mansion party. It was like a new age party. It was actually also the night my birthday was that night. And so all these like synchronicities, right? All these things. I meet this girl. She's visiting from Portland. And so we like immediately connect, chemistry is like off the charts. And so um, we stay in touch. She comes and visits me like one more time in LA, and then after that, so we had literally I think only spent like 5 days together, like total. We were like texting in between, but it was like over I think 1 or 2 months. I decided like I'm going to move to Portland to like be with her, like move in with her. So I do that, and that's yeah, things go super downhill. This leads to the reversion of my story. I knew she had told me that she had like PTSD. So I was aware of that, but I didn't know she also had just like a lot of mental health challenges. And she was struggling with self-harm and suicidal ideation. And basically, as I, moved in with her, it became very apparent, very quickly that this was like really intense. And I had, never dealt with anything like this. But me being this like life coach, right? This spiritual life coach. I thought like I could figure this out. We would figure this out. We would work it out. Even though it was just increasingly over the months. I ended up being there with her a little over a year. And basically for that whole year, it just like, it went from like bad to worse to absolute, just extreme, like worst nightmare you could imagine. And so, yeah, to not get into too many of the details, basically, um, again, I just kept trying to like fix the situation. But as she, started becoming more suicidal, and basically I felt in a position where like, that's a relationship like that is extremely dysfunctional, obviously, and manipulative, because the fear is if I leave, then, what's going to happen. And so I'm trying to like feeling like I have to fix the situation. I have to be the savior of the situation. But ultimately, I finally just reached the end of myself, and I realized that there was no way like I could fix this situation. There's no way I could be the savior here. And after confronting this just like pure darkness that I've never seen before, right? I just shared in my last video that I posted on my channel. It's like in that, because again, I didn't believe in like the devil or Satan in the way that a Christian does at the time. But when you're constantly being confronted with it, and we both were in agreement at that time, like this has to be like demonic, like there's something going on here. That really like made me turn to Jesus. Like after, again, I had all these different new age teachings and practices and meditations and things I was doing. It was just like, there was nothing that could help me in that situation except for Jesus. And so I cried out to Jesus, and thanks be to God, our relationship did end. And we were able to send her to get some help. And so I'm really grateful that, again, we both, like literally just the fact that we both survived, I'm like just so grateful to God for every day. And it was a period of about, I think, 2 months or so after that, now I'm just praying to God, like I'm completely broken, I'm crushed, I'm confused. I'm like, how did this happen? How did I get into this big of a mess, right? And so my prayer to God was just like, God, like just show me the truth, right? And so like, again, being fully, completely, like Bali brought me to my knees, but this time like I was like on my knees until like I saw the truth. Basically, it was like, God, like please, like show me, like I need to understand what happened here. How did this happen? How did I get here? What do I need to learn from this situation? And so that was like my constant prayer daily for days. And then I started to come across different books and videos and YouTube videos and testimonies of people coming out of the new age. And so yeah, over a period of a few weeks and months, it just like the veil was lifted from my eyes. I could see clearly all the decisions I had made, and how, again, like I'd been just straying further and further away from God, becoming more and more prideful, and believing myself to like, I really believed at one point that like I was God and I could do anything and have anything. And obviously that just led me to a very, very dark place. And so thanks be to God, again, I was able to see all that, renounce all of the new age, practices and teachings, and repented of my past. It was, that moment of extreme just sorrow and heartbreak to see clearly all of your sins and to, all of my sins, and to see how, again, how I had just been rebelling against God without knowing it, right? That's the interesting thing. Like when you're going through it, you think I thought I was like pursuing God, but in hindsight, once you're fully have humbled yourself and fully given yourself to God and seen the truth that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior of the world, then I could see, again, could start to discern and see through the false light of New Age spirituality and start to see, just start to see that not all spirits are good and not everything that's spiritual is good. And so I think that's, again, one of the biggest lessons that I was sharing in my last video, right? Just that, like, Satan can masquerade as an angel of light. And so this is where, it's been a year and a half or so now, and I'm just continuing to learn and continuing to grow, and thanks be to God, he's made me a new creation. But as we know, it's a process of sanctification and just continuing every day to remember what he's brought me out of, and to just continue to try to pick up my cross and share my story for his glory. So here we are.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful how Tolkien's study said humility is the virtue to break that sin. Right as you were talking about humility, it was perfect timing. And nice. That often, I mean, every story that I've heard anyway, that breaking point of Jesus coming in and wrenching the person out of the New Age, I'm flailing about here, is that moment of humility, when you humble yourself to it and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, it's my actions, because of me, I've walked away from the protection of God. I want to ask a question to both of us, because Sovereign Cosmic Wildman has by the way, amazing name on YouTube, by the way. That's awesome. But we had a question here that I think is really interesting. So yeah. When entrenched in the New Age occult, are you aware of your thoughts being influenced by deceptive fallen spirits, or was it tough to see at the time and only now more clear looking back? Do you want me to go first? Do you have anything to say on this? I can riff on this for a second, give you a second to think if you want, or do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, no, definitely. But you go first.
Okay, I thought that this was a perfect lead-in from what you were just talking about, because your last video where you talk about Satan masquerading as an angel of light, I thought this was a really great question to fold into that. So to answer this question from my end, I remember toward the end of when I was the deepest in the occult that I actually did start to realize that the inspirations, because this is a phrase that the Catholic Church uses to describe this. There are 3 different types of inspirations, which is to say things that come into our minds, right? We have our own thoughts, that come from ourselves, our own will, our own thoughts. And then you have inspirations that are God and the good angels, and then the other one is inspirations from Satan or demons, right? And so when we're talking about the concept of inspirations and being immersed in the occult, for me, at the end there, I started to question these inspirations that I was receiving. I thought that these were, I didn't know exactly what these beings were at the time. There are lots of different ideas on what these beings are, especially when you're in the New Age. It's a hodgepodge of explanations of what these spirits are. And toward the end, the inspirations that I was receiving started to turn cruel. And there were moments of such strong obsession that I was in the fetal position crying, not able to get these, what I know now were demons, demonic thoughts, intrusive thoughts out of my head. I couldn't fight them off because I wasn't in Christ. I was victim to these demonic onslaughts. At a certain point, though, thank you, Lord, he opened my eyes and lifted the veil, and I was able to recognize these demonic spirits as such. So when I was in the occult, for the years that I was in the occult, there was a confusion over, like, what are these? Because as you've mentioned, Stefano, the concept of good and evil is obfuscated and muddied up when you're in the occult. You don't really believe in evil. It's this question. But toward the end, I started to ask about the concept of evil. When I was doing my interviews with these New Agers, I started to press into the concept of evil, and it started to unravel for me, because I'm like, okay, wait a second. These people don't actually believe in evil. right? And so that was where my Christian upbringing started to rear its head, where it was like the logic was starting to fall apart of the New Age, and it made me start questioning these deceptive fallen spirits. And I remember my gig is up moment. I had that thought in my head, what if this is all evil? Boom. At that exact moment, all of these quote unquote spirits that were pretending to be multidimensional beings or aliens or whatever immediately revealed to be demons, and then they just started attacking me with a fervor. So that was at the moment of my gig is up. What do you have to add into this really great topic?
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I don't know the full timeline of yours, but it sounds like you were, yeah, kind of in more of that middle ground for a little bit, which I think is probably more common maybe for people who come out of New Age, where they're kind of like starting to question, but you're not sure. And then all of a sudden there's that moment of clarity for me, because again, I was so deeply immersed in it and bought into it up until the point where I fully just like broke and just like, I'm like, all right, I can't do this anymore. And so then it was almost like a pretty quick turnaround. So there wasn't much time between there. So for me, yeah, I definitely, and I think, yeah, I think for most people, obviously, until that point where maybe you start to question, or you have a moment of, really being humbled and brought to your knees, up until that point, I think obviously, if you knew you were being deceived, then you wouldn't, you wouldn't obviously go that route. So that's where I do think it is important. And I try my best when talking about these things and sharing my testimony, like that, most people, if not all 99% of people in these spaces, right, are genuinely searching for the truth and for God, and they are well intentioned and they want to help people and help themselves and help others. And but that's so I think, yeah, for me, it was a pretty quick turnaround from having no idea basically that I was being, deceived by these false light demons and, disguised as angels, to then all of a sudden realizing that, yeah, that any spirit that's not pointing you to the Lord, to Jesus Christ, the, Jesus of Nazareth of the Bible, is a false, spirit, or is a, if it's can be is a spirit disguised as a being of light that actually is leading you further away from God. Which, again, looking at all my experiences, and I know everybody's just different as far as like spirit guides and different beings and stuff like that. For me, it was never like not super like tangibly like I was communicating with like a specific being necessarily. It was more broad or ambiguous, I guess. Often for me, it was like thinking I was connecting to like my higher self or the universe. But again, looking at the fruits of that, obviously, again, it was taking me further and further away from God and making me more and more prideful and, relying, more self-reliant and less reliant on the true God. And so, yeah, I think that's where, looking back on it, it's, yeah, it's deceptive just because, again, I mean, that's what the Bible teaches us in the first book of the Bible, right? Like it, is promising one thing, but obviously ends up leading you to something else. But
Right.
Usually it's until that very end that you'll kind of start to see that. And yeah.
Yeah, and demons play nice, right? Demons will deceive because they'll pretend to be a good spirit. And this happens a lot in the New Age. You're dealing with a smattering of demons, some of them pretending to be nice, some of them not so nice, right? None of them are nice. It's all relative there. And I want to talk about that for a second. I want to pull this up and define the occult. So it's a belief system centered upon revealing hidden knowledge and harnessing hidden power through mental and physical ritualistic practices fueled by satanic signs and wonders. And Satan draws people into the occult by use of two interlaced systems that interact with each other. And this is what we've been talking about this entire hour. It's the light occult and the dark occult. These work in concert with each other to draw people in. You have the light occult, which is the deceptive shiny thing on the surface, quote, Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And then the dark occult is the underlying dark occulted hidden reality, which is to say that all these are drawing you, as you mentioned, Stefano, away from Christ, away from God, reconciliation and communion with God. And we know that it is only Jesus Christ who breaks the chains. For me, I don't know about you, Stefano, but when I left the occult and received the truth in a brand new, deep way of how Jesus did not just save us from all of our sins, which I think a lot of people can sort of package that into something that's hard to grasp, right? And I think like for us from childhood, you're raised in a Christian family and that's what you're told, that's what you hear, and you're like, okay, yeah, maybe that's true. But how does it affect me personally? What is my grasp? What is my understanding of how that impacts me now and for the rest of my life into eternity, right? And for me, whenever I left the occult and I was getting into the word, the Lord was just baptizing me in the word, opening up the scriptures to my eyes. I was in the book of Romans and coming into the truth, not just intellectually, but going down past my brain, because I'm an intellectual, and descending into my heart and cracking open the strongholds of the lies that I was just washing myself over. And you described this as well, just the brainwashing of the self, of the lie, which is to say that we can ascend into godness on our own, through our own actions, through ourselves. And it's not the truth. Jesus came into the world to actually die for us, to bear the weight of those sins, so that it can open up that pathway for us to return into communion with God. And when the reality of that hit me, it was like I seriously, literally felt thousands of pounds of weight lift off of my body. I experienced that deliverance, and I was experiencing the entire world crying out in worship to God. I could feel Jesus in all things, holding all things together, the reconciling force of the universe. And that's, you were talking about how we can, in the New Age, you call God the universe. It's like, no, God's the creator. God created the universe. Christ is the force that holds the entire universe together, And when we start talking about the New Age and the chains that are broken, when you step into the truth, how did that affect you? How has that been unfolding for you in the last year?
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing, and I love how descriptive you are with that, because it's so hard to put it into words sometimes. But for me, I think initially it was just this. It's like, it feels like an understatement to say like it was a weight lifted off of my shoulders, right? Because it's like you literally, or I literally could, in that moment, again, you don't know it until your eyes are open, the veil is lifted. Again, I thought I was like living in freedom and liberation and all this stuff, but then all of a sudden it's like I could see how like all this stuff I had done had put me in bondage with Satan, and I was struggling with like depression and anxiety and all these things, and I could see like how over time I was getting more and more like unstable. And at the end, especially with that extremely traumatic dysfunctional relationship and how that all ended, which again was ultimately a giant blessing in disguise because it did bring me back to God, but I was so broken and traumatized after that. So there's a natural healing process that has to happen there. I totally just lost my train of thought.
Yeah, no, we're talking about, I'd love to hear more about how, because I know you have an online ministry now, and I think it's so epic. So can you talk us into like how this has unfolded for you in the last year, just coming back to your faith and what that has looked like for you?
Yeah, it's been a journey. But basically I did, I guess, just to wrap up that previous piece there, it was just like there was so much healing I needed. Like from all the years, right? There's just all this traumatic, like I often will say now, I realize like I think a lot of people go into the like self-help and new age stuff because they have a lot of like childhood like trauma and things that they're trying to heal. I mean, we all have some level of trauma, but obviously some we've experienced deeper trauma than others growing up. And I didn't really ever I didn't have like any intense like capital T trauma growing up. And I realized the deeper I went into that stuff, and over all those years, I started creating traumatic experiences. Mm. And so again, there's all these things I needed to heal from. And again, thanks be to God, once I gave my life to him, he poured his, perfect love and mercy out upon me. It's like there was this like instantaneous like healing, and I do feel like I was like made a new creation. And there were so many like I always say, like I feel like especially in that first year, like I experienced more healing in that first year than I had in the previous like 10 years. And so there's just so much healing, and a lot of these like addictions basically I had, smoking weed like every day, especially like in that final year in that relationship. I was like smoking weed like constantly, and other things that I never again like identified as like addictions, but just obviously like I've struggled a lot with sexual sin and lust, which again I hadn't at the time. I thought I was like, oh, I'm just free, I'm doing what I want. But all of those things, like thanks be to God, like just by the grace of God, like I just have like zero desire for any of those things anymore. And now I think once I hit like the 1 year mark, it's become now a more, I think God like poured out a ton of grace on me in that first year. And now it's more of that, I think, consciously building these virtues and being disciplined, and continuing to stay in the word, and continuing to, go to daily mass as much as I can, and be in the sacraments, and all of those things. So, and thanks be to God, like I just had such an immense, like I was just so on fire for the Lord, right? Like after a dramatic conversion, reversion experience like that, that's all I wanted to do, like in the first year, especially again, like the first few months. But I think as, time goes on, I think now it becomes a little bit more of, there's still that fire there, but I think it's a little bit more of a conscious intention to not start to become like more lax about it, and just continuing with the discipline. So, but yeah, so to answer your other question though, I'll try to, I'm super long-winded, so I apologize.
No, you're doing great.
I started sharing my story, or like my testimony. First thing was because again, I consciously, like internally had made the decision, like I never want to touch any of this new age stuff, law of attraction, any of that stuff, again, psychedelics. But because I had also been sharing this stuff publicly with my life coaching business, I knew I also was super convicted, like I have to share this publicly. So the first thing I did was write a long Facebook post kind of explaining everything that happened, and that I was renouncing New Age, giving my life to Jesus Christ. And so, that obviously came with a mixed bag of responses, as you know, when you've started to have, and I didn't have like a big audience, it was a pretty small audience, but still, that post obviously was got a lot of different responses. And then after that, I did take a break and was praying to the Lord whether or not he wanted me to continue doing that. Part of me really wanted to just like never come online again and just leave that all in the past. But after praying about it, I did decide that I felt that the Lord was leading me to use these platforms now for him, right? So like I basically decided that these, my YouTube channel, which I just started that recently, but like my other social media platforms, I just gave it all to the Lord for his glory, right? Sharing my story, my testimony for his glory, and to hopefully bring others closer to Christ. And so I started doing that over the first year. And then it was just about 4 months ago, I wanted to wait before I started the YouTube channel because I was so fresh out of it. And I was like, all right, let me give myself some time, kind of get more on my feet before I decide to do that. So once I hit like the 1 year mark, that was when I started thinking more about starting the YouTube channel. And so, my first video, I just put up my full testimony. It's like a 50-minute video. So pretty deep dive into the full story that I shared here, but we did we went pretty deep on this one too. So I'm glad we were able to cover a lot, but that was my first video. And then I've just been trying to share every other week for the last few months, a new video on just different topics. But now I'm actually, and after we did this live stream today, I'm thinking starting this Friday, I think I'm going to actually try going live and see if maybe I just do like a weekly live stream or something like that. So we'll see.
That's awesome. Well, I have to say you were very refreshing for me to stumble across, because you were talking about something that I have talked about a lot privately, but never publicly. So I want to commend you for stepping out. Okay, the first video that I ever saw of yours, it came up on my Instagram feed, and you were like, what's up with all this like New Age to Jesus stuff and no Catholic influencers? Right. You're like, everybody that goes New Age to Jesus is all a bunch of Protestants, which is fine, but like, you're like, where are my Catholic peeps at? Like, what's going on? And I was laughing. I thought that was so funny because, I have asked the same question myself. I feel like it's the New Age to Jesus media sphere is dominated largely by Protestants, and so I think it's interesting because my ministry is ecumenical. I choose to express my faith through the Catholic faith, and through the academy where I work with people coming out of the New Age. They're all in different denominations. A lot of them, they're not even talking denomination at that point. They're being saved out
Right.
of the New Age. Like we're getting them in the Gospels. We're getting, and so it's going to land people in different places. And so I think it's interesting that you've stepped out as a Catholic. And do you have any stories to share with us, like what that's been like in particular for you?
Yeah, no, that was it was a huge, like, so after, like my initial, like, being saved out of all of that, and I've kind of been connecting more dots about this recently, like why that is, because that was like really perplexing to me. I was just like kind of confused at first, because I came across, like Stephen Barkans, I think is how you say it, Doreen Virtue, and so some of these other like big ex New Agers who are now sharing their New Age to Jesus testimony. So I think a lot of people naturally, like, they come across those videos first, and they're Protestant non-denominational Christians, and so I think that's one reason why I think most people just tend to go that route, because they're coming across those people, and then obviously those people are kind of guiding them in that direction. But personally, after a few months, and I knew that, all right, Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, like you're saying. I wasn't really thinking about denominations at that point, but obviously then at a certain point, and I moved back in with my parents again, and they're happy that I've had this realization. But now I have to make this decision because my family's Catholic, but I'm consuming all this content from these Protestants, and so I felt this conflict again, where I'm like, well, most important thing for me, right, is like, I don't want to be deceived again. I want to make sure I'm following the truth, and so I can't just go decide I'm going to be Catholic just because my family's Catholic, and I can't just do it just because that was where I came from. If anything, I had more resistance to Catholicism because of that reason, and because, again, I'm seeing all these other New Agers becoming Protestant or non-denominational. I'm thinking, like, that must be right, but I have to figure this out for myself, right? So I really started to dig into it, and just having a lot of conversations. I went to different, like, non-denominational churches, which was a cool experience because I had never done that growing up. I had only ever been to the Catholic Church, so that was all I knew. And so it was cool to kind of see that, kind of get those different experiences. And just through a lot of mainly self-research and prayer, a lot of time in prayer, and praying, asking the Holy Spirit, kind of the same prayer that brought me to Jesus in the first place, like, just show me the truth, keep, like, revealing the truth to me. It became pretty clear to me that the Catholic Church was the fullness of truth, was the one true Church of Jesus Christ. And so that was my second video, because after I made my testimony video, I think I mentioned that I reverted back to the Catholic Church, but I didn't really talk much about it. And so once I shared that video, though, again, now I'd already started connecting with a lot of these other New Agers who are now Protestant. And then they see this stuff, and I'm posting some of the stuff. So then they start kind of bombarding me with, like, oh, the Catholic Church is, not true, and false teaching and all this stuff. So then I felt like I had to make this video to just kind of explain. It's like the top 5 reasons why I decided to, that the Catholic Church is the true church. So if anybody's interested in that, you can check that out. But that video, I think, summarizes pretty well some of the main points. And similarly, like, ultimately, I'm just, like, any opportunity I have to share, whether they're Catholic or Christian, like, I think it's so important that we do, be having open dialogues and conversations, and uniting where we can. And obviously, when I came across you, I was stoked too, because I was like, finally, there's another ex-New Ager who's actually Catholic. I think I'd come across like maybe a few other, like a handful, if that, of like New Age to Catholic testimony, like videos. Right. There's like a handful of them.
But then that's it.
Like, people were actually creating content. And then, seeing, once we connected, and all the stuff you've put together for Spirit Sanctified and all the, resources and guides in your academy and everything. I was like, wow, this is amazing. So yeah, major props to you for all the work that you're doing. And I'm really glad that we're connecting like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's exciting because I do feel like Catholics need to step into the conversation. So it was like interesting because as the Lord was convicting me, like, okay, Teresa, time to get back online. Because the last 2 years I've been running the academy behind closed doors because it's so much work that I can't do both, And so now that like I went through 2 years of that and then wrote the book on it, and then now the book is about to go into publishing, like I'm in the editing process, that's almost done. So all that has been so much work that now it's only like now even available to me to turn over into the media side again. And so it was really good timing to see your content come through, and I'm very energized by it. And I think part of the reason why it's so crucial for us as Catholics to enter into the conversation specifically about New Age to Jesus, and I love that this just came up, is the concept of confession. Because to me, just from my personal experience and walking multiple people out of the occult, you see the different ways that they choose to walk out their faith. Totally fine, but observing the Catholics specifically, there's an element where you see the deliverance process through confession, which is so beautiful because it's the examination of conscience and arriving and showing up and going through that sacrament, receiving that grace, leaning in and doing it over and over and just pressing in and going deeper and deeper. I see so much beauty in that. So I wanted to,
so nourishing, and I talk about that a lot in that video. It's just like that's such a key part of why what ultimately led me back to the Catholic Church as well.
So this is a perfect serve up, Stefano, because I think for our next stream, if you'll come on the show again, I think we should do an entire show just talking about this, because I think that, especially given that there's not really much Catholic content out there related to New Age to Jesus, I would love the opportunity for us to go into that specific part of our testimony after we've come back to Christ and forward and walking out that deliverance process and what that's looked like for us through the sacraments and those sorts of things. I do have one question that I want to drop before we wrap up because it's a great question. Jamie asks, by the way, and Jamie is also an author for Spirit Sanctified, and she has a YouTube channel as well, so you guys check out her on YouTube. She also talks about New Age to Jesus content specifically around yoga. She asks, did Stefano cut out people from his past still involved in the New Age?
This is a great question. So my answer to that would be no. Like, I don't feel like I've cut people out. Again, when I made that post, obviously, I think the way some people may interpret that is like, oh, now they don't necessarily want anything to do with me. But for me, it's like my door is always open. I try to be as, charitable as possible, right? Especially like in that post and in like all the videos I make, like, obviously I understand, right? We understand people in those spaces. We spend so much time in those spaces. So I'm not here to, condemn or judge anybody. But yeah, I've tried my best to, and there were specific people, particularly like certain clients that I had worked with that I felt like I had to personally reach out to. And so I did that. And thanks be God, there's a couple of them that at least that I'm still like in conversation with. And that's, and there's been other people who have reached out who, they're like curious and asking questions. And some people, one girl who I had met in one of those New Age communities who's started going to a Catholic church for the first time. She had no Christian background or anything at all. So, there's definitely, those are the types of things that are very encouraging and keep me, motivated to keep sharing these types of things. But unfortunately, as I think is the case for most people from what I hear, it's hard to stay in touch with a lot of people in those spaces because we have free will and everybody's kind of doing what they want to do. So my door's always open, but yeah, I'm not in touch with most people, unfortunately, from those spaces these days.
I want to add into this conversation. I'm going to pull up our infographic here on leaving the occult. So this is the Deliverance Roadmap Part 2, right? So coming out of the occult, sometimes people have what I call the in-between, where they're actually, after their gig is up, sometimes people won't immediately turn to Christ because maybe they weren't raised that way, or they're just in that in-between. And then at a certain point, there's going to be a change. They come to Christ, they turn away from the occult, they take action to choose Christ, then they enter, and this is going to look different for everybody, but I call it the woods. A lot of times when people have demonic attachments and they're getting out of the occult and they were leaning into their relationship with Christ, there is a period of time where it gets harder before it gets better. And when you enter into this time where Satan is trying to keep a hold of you, it's going to look different for everyone. I don't know if you experienced this, Stefano. It doesn't sound like you experienced too much of that. Oh, he's nodding. Okay. Okay.
Definitely
So
did.
it sounds like this is resonating with you. Okay. We'll get to that in a
Yeah.
second. Actually, I want to hear about that. But so in the woods, spiritual attacks increase. This is a very, very crucial time for perseverance. And this is where the sacraments can come in and be like really, really incredible, and just leaning into your faith, leaning in, leaning in, leaning in. But a huge part that I teach for people coming out of the occult when they enter the woods after they've chosen Christ as their Lord and Savior and they're leaning into their faith, I call it close the doors. And a lot of times this means they need to close all the doors that they can. They need to analyze, assess their lives, and go, what doors do I have open that I need to close? Oftentimes, one of the very first things I will tell people is close the doors to the people that are in the occult. Does it mean that after you're completely out of the woods and you've entered the world again and you've gone through your healing and you're
Right.
fine now? Maybe that can change then according to what God has called you to do and be available. You know what I'm saying? And I believe that obviously you're at that point, Stefano, which is, we're
Yeah,
talking
those
about
first
that
few
now.
months, I
Yeah.
guess that would have been that period of those first few months for me where I, was totally offline, not communicating with anybody. I had to like just figure things out. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And so I bring this up just for people watching this show to just analyze wherever you're at in this journey. If you left the occult and you're anchoring to Christ, there could be circumstances where, like, if you're in the woods, like, close those doors, right? But if you're years along your journey and God has called you to minister in whatever capacity He's called you to, obviously take that to prayer, take that to God, and He will make it clear to you which relationships are valuable and which need to be closed. So thank you, Jamie, for that question. That's really, really great.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was curious what your take was on that. And yeah, it's again helpful to look at it in that kind of process because it's obviously I went through my process and everybody's process is going to be a little bit different, but there are those steps and that there definitely was that stage where it's like I need zero contact with anybody or anything that even reminds me of that stuff, right? Like you just have to completely disconnect and detach from all of that for a period, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book that is going into publication that I'm writing is or wrote is called The Deliverance Roadmap. So what you just looked at, like that infographic of those 10 steps, like 5 in and 5 out, that is what the book is about. And so it's interesting because after a couple years now of walking with people out of the occult, walking that journey with them and helping them through that, I discovered that there's a clear, like, even though it looks different for everybody, there are some staples that you can see that are checkpoints that like pretty much everybody goes through. And so it's so fascinating to listen to your story and hear you walk that out and what that's looked like. I'm so energized and excited about your ministry, and please keep us in the loop on how we can continue to support you and what you're doing. I think that you have so many gifts and talents to add into the conversation here. So I'm really, really excited to continue this. And let us know about Friday, and we'll make sure that we watch your live stream. And also, can you just tell us really quick where people can find you online?
Yeah, thank you again so much, Teresa, and all glory be to God. Yeah, so we're so blessed. Like just every day, again, and obviously I have my ups and downs and bad days, like everybody else still. But and that's why it's so helpful too. Why I do love selfishly to share these things because every time we get to share, right, like reminds us of what we've been through again. So yeah, I'm on YouTube, The Great Gandini. That's my YouTube channel. And then
I love the handle.
I'm like I was rethinking it because I made it. Okay, so I'll share the quick backstory here because people have asked me too. They're like, why are you calling it that? And like some people I think don't know that Gandini is my last name. So I'm like, well, Gandini is my last name, number one. And then The Great Gandini is kind of it's kind of a joke. It's kind of playful because people used to like say that to me all the time, like growing up. Obviously, like kind of making the reference to like the Great Houdini or something like that. So I just thought it was like kind of a funny, playful, like catchy name to use. But then I was thinking about it, and like as I keep like again going through different stages of just being like humbled even more and more, like even as I'm continuing in this ministry journey now. And I'm like, man, I really hope like it doesn't come across as like being like thinking I'm so great or anything like that, because I definitely don't think that. And I know I'm not, and God has shown me that. So, and I appreciate your kind words, but
well, I think
yeah.
it's great, and it's easy to remember too. Like I'm like, okay, I can remember that.
Good. That was the thought. But yeah, then I was thinking, I'm like, oh, maybe I should like rename it like the Lesser Gandini. But I'm like, it just doesn't have the same ring.
That's funny. Okay, are you Italian? Wait, no, you said you're what?
Yeah. So my dad's side has the Italian heritage, so that's where the
There it
name
is.
comes from.
Nice.
So yeah, it's like a couple generations back. But yeah, I do have some. My name is obviously super Italian, but my parents are from Guatemala.
Nice.
So
Awesome.
anyway, yeah, YouTube is my main focus right now, but I'm also on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. So you can find me on just my name, Stefano Gandini, on those.
Very cool. And I have dropped those. If you're on YouTube, you can go into the description and you can check out those links to follow Stefano online. Also, I have attached a link to his New Age to Jesus testimony, so make sure that you go check it out. And if you guys have any ideas, questions, comments that you want to share with me, you can comment, or you can actually email them to me at contact@spiritsanctified.com for ideas or anything, questions for future broadcasts. And thank you again, Stefano, so much for being here tonight. And I look forward to doing more work with you, and keep up the great work on your end.
Thank you, Teresa. Likewise.
All right. Y'all have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.